A warm, lazy sun hovered over the small town, casting long shadows from the tall trees that lined the streets. The town, nestled between rolling hills and quiet fields, seemed peaceful on the surface. But underneath, there was tension, an unspoken, simmering tension that had long existed in the fabric of the community. In this town, like many others, the divide between neighborhoods was clear, not just in geography, but in opportunity, wealth, and, most obviously, race. On one side of town stood the more affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods with their manicured lawns, while on the other side were the historically black neighborhoods, marked by aging homes, crumbling sidewalks, and an air of neglect. It was in this part of town, just after noon, that the story began to unfold. A white patrol car slowly rolled down one of these streets, its engine rumbling like an unwelcome guest. Behind the wheel sat Officer Brad Miller, a middle-aged cop with a firm jawline and eyes that had seen enough to make them cold. He wore the badge with a sense of superiority, a man who viewed himself as the gatekeeper between order and what he saw as the chaotic, crime-ridden underbelly of the town. It was a role he had long embraced with zeal, especially when patrolling this side of town. As the cruiser moved at a crawl, Brad's eyes scanned the streets. He wasn't just looking for criminal activity, he was looking for anything that didn't seem right to him, any excuse to flex his authority. His deep-seated bias wasn't something he recognized in himself. To him, it was just part of the job. To him, certain neighborhoods required a firmer hand, a sharper eye, and a quicker assumption of guilt. On the sidewalk, a black man in his late 30s walked confidently, dressed in a crisp, tailored suit. He had the air of someone going about his business, perhaps heading to an important meeting. His stride was smooth and unhurried, a man fully aware of his place in the world. His polished shoes tapped against the cracked pavement, the sound of success echoing in an area too often associated with struggle. His name was David Harper, though Brad didn't know it yet, and if he had, it probably wouldn't have mattered. From his patrol car, Brad's eyes narrowed at the sight of David. To Brad, a well-dressed black man walking in this neighborhood felt like a red flag. He felt a stirring in his gut, a familiar sense of suspicion rising unbidden. What's he doing here? Brad thought, his hand already reaching for the steering wheel as he flipped the switch for the lights. The flashing blue and red reflected off nearby windows as he pulled his car over, tires crunching on loose gravel as he stopped. David glanced over at the car with mild curiosity, then back ahead, continuing to walk. He didn't pick up his pace, nor did he slow down. His mind was occupied with larger matters. He was in the final stages of preparing for the town's mayoral election results, though few people knew he was even in the running. He had kept his candidacy quiet, preferring to work behind the scenes, gaining support from those who knew his heart and his plans for the community. His vision was one of unity and progress, breaking down the racial barriers that had divided the town for generations. But Brad had no idea who David was. To him, this was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Hey!" Brad called out as he stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind him with more force than necessary. His voice carried an edge of authority, the kind meant to demand immediate compliance. "You! Stop right there!" David stopped mid-stride, turning to face the officer. His expression was neutral, his body language calm. He was well aware of the officer's assumptions. He had lived through this kind of treatment before, but today something was different. David knew who he was, and more importantly, he knew what was coming for him. He didn't need to bow to this kind of behavior anymore. Brad approached, his posture rigid and confrontational. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, his tone filled with suspicion. His eyes swept over David's attire, the suit, the polished shoes, the briefcase he carried. The contrast between David's appearance and the dilapidated surroundings seemed to set off alarm bells in Brad's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, even though David was doing nothing more than walking. "I'm just walking," David responded evenly, his voice calm, giving away none of the irritation he felt simmering just below the surface. He had learned long ago that confrontation wouldn't help in situations like these. Patience was key. Yet inside, a quiet defiance stirred. He had spent his life being treated like a suspect, even when he had done nothing wrong. "Walking, huh?" Brad's tone was mocking now, as though the very idea that a black man could walk freely through this neighborhood without a reason was suspicious. "In a suit? Where you headed?" David met Brad's gaze, refusing to look away. "I don't think I'm required to explain myself, officer. I'm not doing anything wrong." Brad's jaw clenched. He didn't like the calm confidence radiating from David. It was the kind of self-assurance he wasn't used to seeing from men like him. To Brad, it was almost a challenge, and he didn't take challenges lightly. "You look a little out of place here. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." David raised an eyebrow. "Is walking suspicious now?" The cop bristled, his authority being questioned in a way that made his blood run hot. "Look, I'm going to need to see some ID. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." David sighed inwardly, but remained composed. He could already see how this would play out. A simple walk turned into an unnecessary confrontation. With a measured motion, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his ID without a word. Brad snatched the ID, glancing at it briefly, but the name didn't register with him. David Harper. To him, it was just another name in a long line of people he had stopped for suspicious behavior over the years. But soon he would learn how wrong he was. Without bothering to return the ID immediately, Brad shoved it into his pocket and began his usual line of questioning. "What's in the briefcase?" he demanded, already moving to inspect it without asking permission. David's patience was wearing thin now, but he maintained his composure. "It's personal documents, nothing that concerns you." Brad's eyes flicked up to David's face, his lips curling into a sneer. "Well, I'll be the judge of that." He motioned for David to place the briefcase on the hood of the patrol car. "Open it." A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance, some residents cautiously stepping outside their homes, watching with a mixture of concern and anger. It was a scene they had seen before, yet another black man being hassled by the cops for no apparent reason. A few people had their phones out, recording, but no one intervened. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that had been building in this town for years. David placed the briefcase on the car, but did not immediately open it. He knew what was inside: campaign materials, speech notes, plans for the future of the town. But he also knew that Brad wouldn't care. Not yet, anyway. "I don't think this is necessary," David said quietly. "I'm not a threat, officer." But Brad wasn't listening. He was too wrapped up in his own authority, too sure of his right to exert control over anyone he deemed out of place. The tension between Officer Brad Miller and David Harper escalated as the crowd of onlookers grew slightly larger, with several people taking out their phones to record the encounter. Brad noticed the smartphones aimed in his direction, but he didn't care. In fact, he almost welcomed it, thinking it would only serve to bolster his image of being the no-nonsense cop who kept his town in order. To him, this was just another routine stop, a momentary inconvenience that wouldn't lead to anything more than a little paperwork later. David, however, could sense the situation turning in a different direction. He wasn't just some random passerby caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had worked too hard, climbed too many uphill battles, and faced too many obstacles to let this moment pass without consequence. Still, he kept his cool, knowing that losing his temper would only feed into the narrative Brad was trying to craft. His calmness was a quiet power, one Brad couldn't understand, let alone match. As Brad stared down at the briefcase on the hood of his patrol car, his face twisted into a scowl of determination. David watched him closely, his posture steady but filled with a quiet tension. He wasn't afraid. No, he had faced worse than this. But he was tired of these games. Games where people like Brad played judge, jury, and executioner in a matter of seconds, without knowing anything about the person standing in front of them. Brad didn't know who he was dealing with, and the irony of that wasn't lost on David. "You gonna open it, or do I have to do it myself?" Brad barked, his hand already hovering over the latch of the briefcase, ready to pry it open without a moment's hesitation. David exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he weighed his options. He could open it, but why should he have to? Why should he submit to this blatant overreach of power? He knew his rights, and right now this wasn't a matter of law. It was a matter of ego. Brad's ego. "You don't have the right to go through my personal property without a reason, officer," David said, his voice measured and composed, though a sharper edge lingered underneath his calm tone. "I'm not under arrest, and you don't have probable cause." Brad's eyes flared with annoyance. The audacity of this man, daring to challenge him, daring to tell him what he could or couldn't do. His grip tightened on the briefcase, and for a split second, his knuckles whitened as if he might open it by force. But the eyes of the crowd, those recording phones, made him think twice. Instead, he leaned in closer to David, his voice lowering, but the threat in it clear. "Listen here," Brad growled. "I don't need a reason. I'm an officer of the law, and you're acting suspicious as hell. A man like you, dressed like that, walking through this part of town? What am I supposed to think? You could be dealing drugs for all I know." David almost laughed at the ridiculousness of it. He wanted to point out that men in suits didn't typically stroll around with drugs in a leather briefcase. But he bit back the retort, knowing that Brad's assumptions were based on nothing more than his skin color. This wasn't about the suit or the briefcase or the neighborhood. It was about the fact that David, a black man, dared to walk freely in a place Brad didn't think he belonged. "You're supposed to think that maybe I'm just a man walking down the street," David replied, his voice still calm, but now tinged with the weight of years of injustice. "You don't know me. You don't know what I do or who I am. And yet, here we are." Brad snorted, shaking his head, dismissing David's words like they were nothing. "You think you're special or something, huh? Think you can talk your way out of this?" His eyes bore into David's, a sneer twisting across his lips. "I know your type. You all think you're untouchable. But let me tell you something. You're not." David tilted his head slightly, taking in the officer's words, his face unreadable. Inside, though, a flicker of anger sparked, not because of what Brad said specifically, but because this scenario was all too familiar. Men like Brad had been telling him he wasn't untouchable his whole life. They had told him he was limited, that there was a ceiling he wasn't allowed to break through. And yet, here he was, on the verge of becoming mayor of this very town. The irony of it all would be laughable if it weren't so painful. Brad, oblivious to the truth of the situation, mistook David's silence for defeat. Satisfied that he had asserted his dominance, he straightened up and waved his hand dismissively. "Open the case, or I'm taking you in for obstruction." David's eyes flashed with restrained frustration. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting to see how he would respond. He didn't want to give Brad the satisfaction of bending to his demands, but at the same time, he wasn't here to make a scene. There was a bigger picture at play, one that Brad couldn't even begin to comprehend. David knew his day would come soon enough. "I'll open it," David said, his voice cool but resigned. He clicked the latch on the briefcase, lifting the top to reveal neatly organized documents, papers outlining his platform for the mayoral race, budget plans, community initiatives, and strategies for revitalizing the town. Brad glanced down, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents, but his brain didn't seem to connect the dots. He was looking for something incriminating, something illegal, but all he saw were papers that he didn't care to understand. "What's all this?" Brad asked, a note of confusion creeping into his voice. He had expected drugs, or at least something suspicious, but these were just documents. David watched him carefully, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Plans for the future," he said, his voice laced with a quiet triumph. "This town's future." Brad looked at him skeptically, still not grasping the significance of what he was holding. He flipped through the papers, but nothing stood out to him. "Future of what? You some kind of businessman or something?" David let the question hang in the air for a moment before answering. "You could say that. I have some leadership plans for this town." Brad scoffed, tossing the papers back into the briefcase as if they meant nothing. "Yeah, well, whatever it is, keep your nose clean. I'm watching you." He straightened his uniform, trying to reassert his dominance, but the encounter had lost some of its momentum. David's calm defiance was disarming in a way Brad couldn't fully articulate. David shut the briefcase and calmly locked it, his hands steady and sure. He looked Brad directly in the eyes, his gaze steady and unyielding. "I'm sure you'll be seeing me around soon enough, officer." he said with a subtle edge that Brad didn't fully register. Very soon? Brad turned away, feeling the eyes of the crowd still on him. Some were whispering, others shaking their heads. He felt a flicker of doubt, but it was quickly buried beneath his usual bravado. He had done what he always did, asserted control, made sure the suspect knew who was in charge. As far as he was concerned, that was the end of it. He didn't give it a second thought as he got back into his patrol car and drove off, leaving David standing there with the crowd dispersing. David watched the patrol car pull away, a smile now fully forming on his face. The irony of the situation was almost too perfect. Very soon, he thought to himself. Very soon, Officer Brad Miller would know exactly who he had humiliated. The sun continued its slow descent, casting a golden light over the town as it moved closer to dusk. David picked up his briefcase, squared his shoulders, and continued walking, his path now cleared, his steps steady. He had faced men like Brad before, and he would face them again. But soon, very soon, the tables would turn. And this town, whether Brad liked it or not, was about to get a new kind of leadership. The next morning, the town of Riverton buzzed with anticipation. It was the day the results of the mayoral election would be announced. For months, the race had garnered attention, not only from the local community, but also from surrounding towns. The incumbent, Mayor James Whitman, had held the office for nearly a decade, a figure synonymous with the town's old ways of doing things, an era where tradition ruled over progress. But the challenger, David Harper, had quietly risen from the background, an underdog to many but a symbol of hope to others. Few in the town had expected David to gain the kind of momentum he did during his campaign. While his candidacy had started small, largely unnoticed by the broader public, it gradually picked up steam. His platform was one of inclusion, economic revitalization, and police reform, issues that had long been whispered about but never addressed in any meaningful way. He had spoken to the frustrations of the Black and marginalized communities, the working-class families, and the young people who felt stifled by the town's stagnant economy. He promised change, not just in policy, but in the fabric of the town itself. As the clock ticked toward noon, people began gathering at Riverton's town square, where the election results would be formally announced. The square, usually quiet and unassuming, was now a hub of excitement. Banners from both campaigns were still hanging, fluttering in the soft autumn breeze. On one side, Whitman's name was emblazoned in bold letters, a symbol of the establishment. On the other, David's more modest banners bore the simple slogan, "A future for all." Across town, Officer Brad Miller started his morning shift like any other. He was completely unaware that the man he had humiliated the previous day was about to change the course of his future in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Brad's routine was simple: grab a coffee, scan the early morning reports, and head out to patrol the same streets he'd driven for years. His interactions with David the day before were already fading into the blur of the countless stops he had made over the years. For Brad, that moment was just another part of the job. In the police station, conversations buzzed among his fellow officers, but Brad didn't pay much attention. They were talking about the election, speculating on who would win. Many assumed Mayor Whitman would hold on to his seat, the safe, predictable choice for Riverton's future. They spoke of David Harper as an unknown, someone who had come out of nowhere. Brad, still nursing his coffee, only half listened as his colleagues tossed around names, throwing in a few jokes and dismissive remarks about Harper's campaign. "Can you imagine? That guy is mayor?" One officer laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "He's too green. Doesn't know the first thing about running a town like this." "Yeah," another chimed in. "Plus, Whitman's got the old money behind him. People like stability, you know? They don't want someone shaking things up too much." Brad remained silent, thinking only briefly about David. His face flashed in his mind for a moment, but Brad pushed it aside. He didn't think anything would come of it. After all, David had been just another man walking through a neighborhood. Nothing more, nothing less. To Brad, people like David didn't hold real power, not in Riverton. Meanwhile, in town square, a large crowd had gathered. Families, business owners, community leaders, and reporters from local news stations all stood in anticipation. The small podium set up in front of the courthouse was draped in American flags, and behind it, a large screen was ready to display the final vote tally. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, teenagers hung around the edges of the crowd, and older residents exchanged hushed conversations about what this election could mean for their town. At the heart of the crowd stood David Harper, dressed in another impeccably tailored suit, surrounded by a close-knit group of supporters. His wife, Lisa, held his hand, squeezing it gently as they exchanged a glance. She had been his rock throughout the campaign, standing beside him when the late nights and early mornings threatened to wear him down. Today, as they stood side by side, the culmination of months of hard work and dedication was about to unfold before them. David looked out over the crowd, his heart swelling with emotion. This was more than just an election to him. This was about the soul of Riverton, about giving a voice to those who had been ignored for far too long. Win or lose, he knew he had started a conversation that couldn't be silenced. Change was coming. He could feel it in the air. As the crowd fell silent, the announcer stepped up to the podium. A ripple of anticipation ran through the gathering, and David could feel his pulse quicken. He kept his face calm, but inside his mind raced. This was it. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here," the announcer began, his voice carrying through the square. "The results of the 2024 mayoral election are in. It's been a hard-fought race, and we appreciate the participation of every citizen who cast their vote. Now, without further delay, let's announce the final tally." The large screen behind the announcer flickered to life, displaying the numbers. For a brief moment, the crowd held its breath as the names of the candidates appeared. Incumbent Mayor James Whitman, 49%. A low murmur went through the crowd, and some of Whitman's supporters shifted nervously. And the challenger, David Harper, 51%. For a moment, there was silence. It was as if the entire town had collectively held its breath, trying to process what had just happened. Then almost all at once, the crowd erupted into cheers. Supporters of David threw their arms in the air, hugging one another, tears streaming down some faces. The energy in the square became electric, the disbelief quickly turning into elation. David Harper, the underdog, had won. He had done the impossible. David stood still for a moment, absorbing the cheers and applause, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt Lisa squeeze his hand harder, her eyes shining with pride. He turned to her and smiled, his throat tight with emotion. This victory wasn't just his. It was for everyone who had been overlooked, everyone who had believed in something better for Riverton. The sound of the crowd swelled as David made his way to the podium, greeted by applause, handshakes, and pats on the back. He stepped up to the microphone, the cheers echoing in his ears as he looked out over the sea of faces. Some familiar, some new, but all united in that moment. He had prepared for this speech, but now standing there, he realized no words could truly capture the magnitude of what this victory meant. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady despite the overwhelming emotions. The crowd quieted, eager to hear what their new mayor had to say. "Thank you all for believing in this vision. This isn't just about me, this is about all of us. It's about building a town where everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, has a place and a voice." The crowd erupted into applause again, and David paused, giving them a moment to soak in the words. He knew this was just the beginning. The work ahead would be hard, the resistance strong, but today was a turning point. "Change doesn't happen overnight," David continued, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. "But together, we can make this town a place where everyone feels they belong, a place where no one is left behind." As David spoke, the gravity of his new role began to sink in for many in the crowd. He was no longer just the man in the suit walking through town. He was their mayor. And with that title came the power to reshape Riverton, to challenge the status quo, and to confront the deep-seated issues that had plagued the town for years. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Brad Miller was just finishing up his patrol when he heard the news on the radio. His brow furrowed in confusion at first, the name David Harper sounding familiar, but not immediately clicking. Then slowly, the realization dawned on him. David Harper. The man he had stopped the day before, the man he had humiliated, the man he had treated like a common criminal. Brad's stomach dropped as the full weight of his actions hit him. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hand tightening on the steering wheel as he replayed the events of the previous day in his mind. The man in the suit, the one he had harassed and belittled, that man was now his boss. The mayor of Riverton. A cold sweat broke out on Brad's forehead. He had treated the future mayor like a suspect, subjected him to unnecessary humiliation in front of a crowd, all because of his own blind assumptions. And now that same man held the power to shape the future of the town, and more specifically, the future of Brad's career. Brad swallowed hard, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. This was no longer just another routine stop gone wrong. This was something much, much bigger. A week had passed since David Harper had been sworn in as the new mayor of Riverton, and the entire town was still buzzing with the energy of change. The air seemed lighter, as if a burden that had weighed down the community for years had been lifted. People spoke about new possibilities, and for many, hope had been reignited. But for some, like Officer Brad Miller, the election result had become a source of growing dread. Brad had done his best to avoid thinking too much about that fateful encounter with David. He had continued his shifts as usual, patrolling the streets, stopping cars, and performing the duties he had grown used to over the years. But there was no denying that something had shifted. Every time he passed by a group of people, he could feel their eyes on him. Sometimes he thought he heard murmurs, whispers of what had happened between him and the new mayor. And when he caught the occasional pointed glance, his chest tightened with anxiety. The reality he had tried to push away was catching up with him. David Harper had become his boss, and not just in a nominal sense. As mayor, David now had the power to reshape the police department and the town's broader relationship with law enforcement. He had campaigned on police reform, something that had caused a ripple of unease throughout the department when he first announced his candidacy. Now, with David in office, those promises were poised to become action, and Brad couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to be caught in the crossfire. On a cold, clear Monday morning, the inevitable happened. Brad received a summons to the mayor's office. It was delivered through his sergeant, who handed him the official letter with an unreadable expression. As Brad unfolded the paper, his heart began to pound. The words blurred for a moment, but then they came into focus. Officer Brad Miller is requested for a private meeting with Mayor David Harper. Monday, 10 a.m. Mayor's office. Brad read the words twice, his stomach tightening with each passing second. The date and time were less than an hour away. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure as his sergeant watched him closely. "Looks like the new mayor wants a word with you," his sergeant said, his tone carefully neutral. But Brad could see the flicker of understanding in his eyes. The whole department knew about the encounter between Brad and David, though it had only been whispered about in the locker rooms and back offices. Brad nodded stiffly. "Yeah, looks like it." He turned and walked out of the office, his mind racing. What could David want? Was this a disciplinary meeting? Had David filed a complaint against him for the way he had treated him? Was he about to lose his job? Each question hit him harder than the last, sending his thoughts spiraling as he drove to town hall. The drive felt shorter than usual, though his hands were sweaty and his heart raced the entire way. When he arrived at the grand, imposing building of the town hall, he parked his patrol car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had always been in control during his patrols, always the one with the authority. But now that authority felt flimsy, like a paper shield against the weight of the consequences he might face. Gathering his courage, Brad finally stepped out of the car, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the entrance. The receptionist greeted him as he entered the building, her eyes briefly flicking up and down in recognition. It was clear she knew why he was here, but she said nothing, simply instructing him to head to the second floor, where the mayor's office was located. The walk up the stairs felt like a slow march towards something inevitable. Brad's boots echoed against the polished tile floor, each step amplifying the weight of his nerves. By the time he reached the second floor, his mouth was dry, and a bead of sweat ran down the back of his neck despite the coolness of the air. Outside the mayor's office, Brad paused for a moment, his hand hovering over the door handle. His mind raced again. He could walk away, feign ignorance, come up with some excuse about a scheduling conflict. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. He had to face whatever was coming, even if he didn't want to. With a deep breath, he knocked twice, and a calm voice from inside the office called out, "Come in?" Brad opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The office was bright, filled with natural light streaming in from the large windows that overlooked the town square. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and in the center of the room, behind a polished wooden desk, sat David Harper. David looked up as Brad entered, his expression unreadable but calm. He was dressed in a dark suit, his tie neatly knotted, and his posture relaxed but commanding. For a moment, Brad's mind flashed back to the day he had stopped David on the street, the man in the suit walking through a neighborhood Brad had patrolled countless times. Now the tables had turned. David wasn't just another man on the street, he was the man in charge. "Officer Miller," David greeted him, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Please have a seat." Brad hesitated, then nodded and sat down. His body felt stiff, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap as he waited for David to speak. The silence in the room stretched for a moment, filling the space with unspoken tension. David leaned back in his chair, studying Brad for a few seconds before speaking. "I'm sure you know why I called you here today." Brad swallowed, his throat tight. "Yes, sir," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. David nodded, tapping his fingers lightly on the surface of the desk. "I want to talk about what happened last week." Brad's stomach dropped, and for a brief moment, he considered defending himself, explaining that he had been just doing his job, that he had no idea who David was at the time. But he stopped himself. There was no point in making excuses. He had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences. "I remember our encounter well," David continued, his voice even, though there was a sharpness to it. "It wasn't the first time I've been stopped by an officer for suspicious behavior, but it was the first time it happened so close to the day I would be sworn in as mayor." Brad shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of David's words settle over him like a heavy blanket. He didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent, waiting for David to continue. "I want to make something clear, Officer Miller," David said, leaning forward slightly. "This isn't about revenge. I'm not interested in punishing you for what happened. But I do want you to understand something. What happened between us wasn't just about you and me. It's about a much bigger problem in this town." Brad blinked, his confusion growing. He had expected anger, a reprimand, maybe even a suspension. But David's tone was more measured, more thoughtful than he had anticipated. David paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "You represent an institution that has, for too long, treated certain people in this town as if they don't belong, as if they're outsiders in their own community, and that has to change." Brad nodded, his throat dry. He felt the weight of the conversation pressing down on him, but he also sensed that this was about more than just his actions. David was talking about the broader issues that had plagued the town for years, the systemic racism, the biases, the inequality. David continued, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not here to fire you or humiliate you. That's not what this is about. But I am here to make sure that going forward, officers like you understand that your job is to serve and protect everyone in this town, not just the people you think fit some arbitrary profile of who belongs and who doesn't." Brad nodded again, feeling a mixture of relief and shame wash over him. He hadn't expected this level of understanding from David, and it only made him feel more aware of his own mistakes. David leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on Brad. "I'm instituting new policies for the police department, effective immediately. There will be mandatory training on racial bias, community outreach, and de-escalation tactics. Every officer will be required to attend, including you." Brad's stomach clenched at the thought. He had been on the force for years, and the idea of having to sit through training sessions on things he thought he already knew felt like a blow to his pride. But he nodded, knowing that refusing wasn't an option. "I also want you to take part in a community engagement program," David added. "You'll spend time working with the very people you've been patrolling all these years. You'll hear their stories, understand their struggles, and maybe, just maybe, you'll start to see them as more than just potential suspects." Brad swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had never been asked to do something like this before, and the idea of it made him uncomfortable. But he could also see that David wasn't asking, he was telling. This was part of the new reality in Riverton, a reality that Brad had no choice but to accept. David stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "I expect you to take this seriously, Officer Miller. We all have a responsibility to make this town a better place for everyone. That includes you." Brad rose to his feet, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over him like a lead blanket. He had come into the meeting fearing for his job, but now he realized that what he had been given was something far more complex. An opportunity for redemption, but also a challenge to confront the very things he had taken for granted for so long. "Thank you, Mayor Harper," Brad said quietly, his voice subdued. David nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I'll be watching." With that, Brad turned and left the office, his mind swirling with the enormity of what had just transpired. As he walked out of town hall and back to his patrol car, the streets of Riverton felt different. The town he had thought he knew so well had changed, and now so too had his place in it. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. As weeks passed following Officer Brad Miller's meeting with Mayor David Harper, the town of Riverton began to feel the first ripples of transformation. The air had shifted, not in any grand or immediate way, but in small, nearly imperceptible changes that signaled the beginning of something new. The kind of change that doesn't arrive with fireworks and banners, but grows slowly, quietly, in the hearts and minds of those willing to embrace it. For Brad, the reality of his new responsibilities was sinking in. His routine, which had once been predictable and familiar, was now filled with uncertainty and discomfort. The training sessions mandated by Mayor Harper were the first major shift. These sessions focused on racial bias, de-escalation, and community relations, topics that, in Brad's mind, had seemed unnecessary before. He had always believed that he understood his job, that he had been enforcing the law fairly, but sitting in a room with his fellow officers, watching videos of confrontations gone wrong, listening to experts talk about unconscious bias, Brad began to feel a deep unease settling over him. The training was led by specialists who had been brought in from outside the town, professionals with experience in reforming police departments in areas with similar issues to Riverton's. At first, Brad had been defensive, sitting at the back of the room with his arms crossed, half listening and half resenting what he saw as an attack on his profession. But as the days went on, something began to shift. The stories shared by the trainers, real-life examples of police encounters that had gone horribly wrong, hit closer to home than Brad had expected. One case in particular stuck with him. A story about a small-town officer who had stopped a young black man for looking suspicious, much like Brad had done with David. The young man had been walking home from work, wearing a hoodie in a predominantly white neighborhood. The stop had escalated, with the officer demanding ID and eventually forcing the man to the ground when he resisted. The situation ended in tragedy. The young man had died in custody from a medical condition that had been exacerbated by the stress of the encounter. The officer had claimed he was just following procedure, but the fallout had been immense. The town had been torn apart by protests and outrage, and the officer's career had been left in shambles. As Brad listened to the story, he felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. The parallels to his encounter with David were undeniable. He had humiliated David on the assumption that a well-dressed black man walking through a neighborhood didn't belong there. And while their encounter hadn't ended in violence, it easily could have gone in a darker direction. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. For the first time in his career, Brad found himself questioning his own instincts. Had he been wrong all these years? Had he been patrolling these streets with blinders on, assuming guilt where there was none? It was an unsettling realization, one that gnawed at him long after the training sessions had ended each day. But the training was only the beginning. Soon after, Brad was assigned to the Community Engagement Program, a direct order from Mayor Harper himself. This was the part of the job that Brad had dreaded the most. He wasn't the type of officer who enjoyed small talk or building relationships with the people he patrolled. He had always seen himself as an enforcer of the law, someone who kept the peace by maintaining order, not by making friends. His first assignment was at the local community center, located in one of the historically black neighborhoods that Brad had patrolled for years. The center was a hub of activity, a place where children played after school, where teenagers hung out, and where adults gathered for community meetings. Brad had driven past it countless times during his patrols, but had never once stepped inside. When he walked through the doors that first day, wearing his uniform and badge, he felt every set of eyes in the room turned toward him. The sense of unease was palpable, and Brad couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong there. He had always been the authority figure, the one people watched from a distance, and now being inside the community center, surrounded by the very people he had once viewed with suspicion, made him feel exposed. A woman named Mrs. Jenkins, the director of the center, greeted him with a polite but measured smile. She was an older woman, with gray hair neatly tied into a bun and sharp, perceptive eyes that seemed to see right through Brad's carefully constructed exterior. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice steady, "we've been expecting you." Brad nodded, trying to keep his voice steady as he replied, "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to help with the program." Mrs. Jenkins gestured for him to follow her. As they walked through the center, passing groups of children and adults, Brad felt the weight of their stares. Some of the kids whispered to each other, glancing up at him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. The adults were more subtle, but their gazes were no less pointed. It was clear that, for many of them, seeing a police officer in their space was unusual and perhaps unwelcome. Mrs. Jenkins led Brad to a small room at the back of the center, where a group of young men and women were gathered. They were in their late teens, some maybe in their early 20s, and they were part of a program designed to provide mentorship and support to youth who were at risk of falling through the cracks, either academically or socially. Brad recognized a few faces from his years of patrolling the neighborhood, but he had never known their names or their stories. They had always been part of the background noise of his job, people he had passed on the street but never engaged with directly. "This is where you'll be working," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice neutral. "We want you to get to know these young people, hear their stories, and help them understand that police officers aren't the enemy." Brad felt a lump form in his throat. He had never thought of himself as the enemy, but standing there in that room, he could feel the unspoken tension. These kids didn't trust him, and why would they? He had spent years patrolling their streets, often treating them as potential suspects rather than members of the community. The first few days were awkward, to say the least. Brad showed up, sat in on the meetings, listened to the conversations, but rarely spoke. The young people were polite but distant, unsure of what to make of him. They talked about their struggles in school, their frustrations with the lack of job opportunities, and the challenges they faced growing up in a town where the police were often seen as adversaries rather than allies. Brad listened, feeling like an outsider in a world he had never truly tried to understand. He had spent so many years enforcing the law, but he had never considered the personal stories behind the faces he saw every day. One afternoon, during a particularly candid conversation about police encounters, one of the young men, Jamal, spoke up. Jamal was 18, tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet intensity about him. He had been in trouble with the law before, mostly for minor offenses, but he was trying to turn his life around. "You know," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm, "we don't hate cops, we just hate the way we're treated by them. Like we're criminals before we even do anything. Like we don't belong in our own neighborhoods." Brad felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had heard variations of this sentiment before, but hearing it from Jamal, who sat just a few feet away, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. For the first time, Brad spoke up. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I didn't see it that way before, but I'm starting to understand, and I want to do better." The room fell silent for a moment, and Brad felt the weight of their stares again. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't suspicion or fear. It was something closer to curiosity. Could he really mean what he said? Could he, a police officer who had once been part of the problem, really change? Over the next few weeks, Brad continued to show up. He talked more, asked questions, and listened with an open mind. Slowly, the young people at the center began to warm up to him. Jamal, in particular, started sharing more of his story, about how he had almost dropped out of school, about how he felt trapped between wanting to stay out of trouble and feeling like trouble was always around the corner. Brad found himself caring in a way he hadn't expected. He had always seen himself as a protector, but now he realized that protecting wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about building relationships, about seeing people as individuals rather than problems to be solved. Meanwhile, across town, David Harper was watching the changes unfold. He had been keeping tabs on Brad's progress, not in an overbearing way, but enough to know that the officer was taking his new role seriously. David had known that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he had hoped that by planting the seeds, the town could start to heal, one small step at a time. One afternoon, David visited the community center himself, walking through the same doors Brad had once dreaded entering. He found Brad in the back room, talking with a group of young people, laughing at something Jamal had said. The sight brought a small smile to David's face. When Brad noticed David, he stood up, a little embarrassed but not uncomfortable. "Mayor Harper," he greeted him, his tone more respectful than it had ever been before. David nodded, taking in the scene. "How's it going here, Officer Miller?" Brad glanced around the room, then back at David. "Better than I expected," he admitted. "I'm learning a lot." David smiled again, nodding. "That's good to hear. This is the kind of change we need." As David left the community center, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The work was far from done, but the progress was real. And for Brad, for the community, and for Riverton, that was enough to believe that better days were ahead.